And we get down to this little crossroads, and as we're about, he's slowing down. Of course, he's being careful with me on the back because I'm only 8 years old. And as he's keying the motorcycle down, he starts to make a turn to the left. And when he does, this huge white, I mean, it was almost bluish white light, perfectly round and huge. It goes like right over almost our heads, just a little bit to the right of us, and it catches his eye as he's turning, and of course I am right behind him, and I could see it perfectly. He slams on brake. We're sitting in the middle of the crossroads. There's no lights. It's nothing like city lights or anything of that nature. It's complete darkness out when you're way out in the country like that. And we just watched this thing, and it is just going, pew! I mean, it's like just as fast as it could go. And he stops the motorcycle, and he, as we watched it go, we were both in awe. I think we probably both had our mouths totally open. And I remember how he turned around to me, and he said, "Joy, did you see that?" And I'm like, "Daddy, what was it? What was it?" And we sat there the longest, and we couldn't say anything to each other. We were just totally mesmerized. Yeah, I mean, it was like that was something we had never seen before. I mean, it didn't have a tail behind it. It was not like a comet. It was not like a meteor.
It was not an orb.
It was just a round, huge, white thing. It had no blinking lights. It was totally white. Well, anyway, we sat there, and he finally got enough nerve to turn the motorcycle around. We decided not to go for the ride that night, and we went back and drove up under the shelter, and he goes, "Joy," he says, "what did you think you saw a while ago?" And we sat under the shelter, and we just sat there, and we tried to figure out what did we really see. And at 8 years of age, I was just blown away because my dad seemed so confused. Now,
but you sound like you've been through a lot.
Well, this makes the story a little bit more interesting when you understand, that I'm writing from a perspective of having experienced things, and I've been, like I say, trying to put the pieces together, and that's what my research is all about. But, when my dad and I walked in the house, I'll never forget my mother going, "What are you all doing back, and what's that strange look on both of your faces?" And we sat down, and we told my mom, we were just like, "You're just not going to believe what we just saw." And we really didn't know what it was.
Did your father look scared, Joy?
He looked scared. Yeah. He looked confused. Now, the interesting thing was, he was a pilot. And when I say pilot for South Georgia, he flew crop dusters.
Okay.
So he was used to, wheeling around, and he could do some really neat
low altitude
tricks,
flips, you name it, he could do it.
Yeah. And we would go, like to Atlanta, which was like 4 hours away, to the airports. And of course, in those days, the airports hardly were non-existent. So we barely ever saw like an airplane other than maybe a crop duster ever fly over our house.
They were more like airfields at the time. Huh?
Right. And they were not even paved. They were just,
dirt,
just flat dirt, with the crop dusters they take off in the fields like that. And so, seeing him be so, like, not knowing what it was, it gave me this really eerie feeling. And I'll never forget, the next day, he came in from town, and he had a paper, and I would give anything to have had a copy of this, but it had UFOs were seen, like, on the East Coast, from, like, Florida all the way up to New York.
I wonder if that was during the Gulf Breeze incident, too.
Well, I was born in 1957, and I was 8, so that was around 1963, 64.
Yeah, well, maybe.
So, but I'll never forget, him bringing that paper home, and he's going, "Joy, I think you and I saw this. I think we saw what this looked like." And from that point on, because I had this strange dream, and because now I had seen something that was unexplainable, and we weren't taking drugs, and we weren't drinking, and we had 20/20 vision, and there was no sound to this object, and it was flying faster than anything I had ever seen. And the fact that my dad had been a pilot, and he was very much into, military kinds of things, and he had books and stuff with planes and pictures and stuff.
And by the way, 87 for Gulf Breeze. Florida.
Yeah.
That came a little after you.
For this, but it was that kind of thing that really started making me think that there's something else to this whole picture. And like I say, as time went on and I began to start putting the pieces together, I began to see that there was a lot of issues in regard to UFOs. And I guess because through the course of my life, I've probably had about, 8 or 9 really good sightings of, aircraft that actually do things that or did things that I don't think we humanly could have existed in.
And no one could explain.
And could not explain. So when I was working on my doctorate, I actually had a sighting that lasted probably about a good maybe hour and a half. And Chris Early, who was with the Georgia MUFON at the time, was a really quite an interesting man. And I called him and I said, Chris, I said, I have seen something in this little town where I live, and I can't explain it. And I said, I've had some sightings that over the years, and I've heard other farmers and things like that have seen things at night when you'd be out, checking tobacco barns at 2 or 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and these lights would be in the sky and they'd be doing really strange things. And of course, we had a lot of cattle. We had black Angus on the farm. And every now and then we'd find these cows down and not really know what happened to them. So I fully believe that we probably were experiencing probably some cattle mutilations in the area, but we were attributing them to maybe the cow being down a little too long and some kind of predator maybe stripping some of the skin off of it. But I can remember as a child, us finding the cows down and some of the skin, some of the hide being removed in certain little areas. And so I think, George, all the time, these little incidents were building in my mind, like, I couldn't put them all in perspective.
It had an incredible effect on that young mind, too.
Yes, it does. And then as you get older and you start reading and then you start expanding your knowledge, getting into college and then getting into classes with professors that were from all different walks of life and being able to ask questions in regard to some of this, you just couldn't seem to find the answers. And it was almost like somebody was trying to keep us from knowing the answer. And I think that really made me start to look as to what is going on, that there seems to be this line of, good people and bad people. In other words, it seemed to me that the people you would ask the questions to, they were very sincere, but if you tried to maybe go up the ladder and really try to find out something from a higher level of a person that might be in an institution of research, that they were afraid to take a step out, because if they did, we can look at the past histories of the UFOs. When people tried to get involved in it, then it cost them usually their discipline. People started saying, oh, well, they're talking about little green men, right. And so then people took them as not being credible. And most people, if you work, all the years that you go to school to get to be a doctor, you don't really want to throw it away. And so I began finding people that I could, go to on the side and say, look, now, I'm not making this up.
Right, and neither are you. So what's going on here?
Yeah, what's the real gist of this? And kind of on the sly, I would finally get people who would, say, well, I saw this, and this is what we think could be going on. And then I started finding out that there were some past documents, that described some of these kinds of strange, ships and things like that. And so I began to look at ancient history and just really started to search in ancient history for some answers. And, of course, Zachariah Sitchin has done a lot of work with the Sumerians. And
you agree with his theory, Joy?
A little bit, I do.
Let's talk about that when we come back with our special guest tonight, Dr. Joy Pugh. I'm George Noory, and this is Coast to Coast AM.